to Loom of dreams. This is a place where stories are woven softly, thread by thread, until they become a blanket of quiet comfort around you. Here we slow down together. We listen, we breathe, and we rest. As you settle into this moment, let your body grow a little heavier, your thoughts a little lighter. The day has done enough. There's nothing left to rush, nothing you need to hold on to, only the gentle rhythm of your breath and the warmth of the evening around you. Before we begin tonight's story, let's take a few moments to settle the body and quiet the mind. If you'd like, close your eyes now. Let the rest of the world fade a little. Notice where you are, the shape of the room, the stillness of the air, the gentle warmth that surrounds you. Now, take a slow breath in through your nose. Feel your chest lift and your belly rise. And then slowly breathe out through your mouth, as if you're blowing warm air onto a window. Let your shoulders drop and feel that breath leave gently, like a sigh. Again, inhale softly, not too deep, just enough to feel the cool air enter. Pause for a moment and exhale slowly. Each time you breathe, imagine the air moving like a wave, in and out, steady and kind. Your body begins to understand this rhythm, the same rhythm as a calm sea at night, the same rhythm as the fire in the hearth. If your mind begins to wander, that's perfectly fine. Just notice it and bring it back to your breath, back to the sound of the fire, back to the quiet in your room. Now feel your body growing heavier, your hands resting loosely, your jaw unclenching, your eyes softening behind closed lids. Let your breath find its own pace. There's nothing you need to do. You are safe, you are home, and you are ready to rest. Tonight, we're returning to the snowy mountains above a quiet Norwegian fjord town to find Liv exactly where we left her, resting in the warm lantern-lit springs with soft steam rising into the winter night. The forest is hushed, the hills are watching, and the water is gently holding the weight she's been carrying for a long time. So, when you're ready, make yourself comfortable. Let your body grow heavy and warm, and slip back into this winter night, where hot springs, deep forest, and a quiet little town are all holding space for you to rest. Here in the warm water, with the mountains enclosing the sky in a white, patient ring, her sense of scale shifted. The city felt far away, not only in distance, but in importance. The rhythm of this place, of steam rising, of snow resting, of water flowing unseen beneath frozen surfaces, made the noise and urgency of another life seem less urgent. Elias's voice joined theirs, low and calm, from the other side of the pool. "The first time is always like this," he remarked. "The body unclenches before the mind quite catches up. It's why your thoughts feel softer here. The mountain holds the rest for a while." Liv could not say exactly what thoughts were unspooling inside her, only that the constant pressure to decide, to define, to explain herself, even to herself, had eased. She felt, in a way that went deeper than words, that she did not have to answer any big questions while sitting in this water. It was enough to feel the heat, to watch the steam, to notice the slow, even beat of her own heart, and how it matched, more and more, the calm around her. After a time, Olia appeared again at the edge of the deck, her shawl wrapped more loosely now that the steam had worked its way into the fabric. She spoke only softly, letting them know that when they were ready, another pool waited just a little higher up the slope, where the heat lingered more deeply and the mist gathered more thickly. They moved from the first pool reluctantly, but without strain, as if each step was a continuation of the rest, not a break from it. Robes went back around their shoulders, absorbing droplets of water and holding the warmth close. The air outside the pool felt cooler now against their damp skin, but the residual heat within them made it pleasant, like a reminder of the water's presence, even once they had left it. A narrow set of wooden steps led upward from the first pool, following the contour of the hillside. Lanterns stood at intervals along the railing, their flames burning a little steadier here, sheltered from the slight movements of air by the surrounding rocks and trunks. As they climbed, the sound of water shifted. It remained gentle, but there was a deeper note to it now, as if it came from a pool set closer to the heart of the spring. The second pool lay in a small hollow, embraced by rock and pine, its surface releasing a thicker veil of steam that curled and folded over itself in slow motion. The lanterns were set lower here, closer to the water, and their light was quickly claimed by the mist, spreading out until it seemed as if the very air glowed softly from within. Beyond the drifting white, the outlines of the slopes and distant ridges were reduced to vague shadows, their details softened almost entirely away.
When Liv eased herself into this second pool, the warmth rose more quickly along her limbs, richer and more encompassing. It was not uncomfortable, but it was more insistent, asking her body to yield a little more fully, to let go of the last traces of cold and stiffness. Eventually she found a place along the curved edge where the stone rose in a gentle slope, just the right height to allow her to lean back and rest her head, the water cradling her shoulders and chest. With the mist thicker here, the world beyond the pool all but disappeared. She could no longer clearly see the individual trunks of the trees or the line where snow met sky. Only the suggestion of darker shapes remained at the edges of her vision, like distant memories of the mountains rather than their immediate presence. What stayed clearly visible were the lanterns, their round halos of gold hovering in the whiteness, and the faint suggestion of movement where steam met cooler air above. The effect was strangely comforting. It felt as though the boundaries of her immediate world had been drawn closer, not to confine her, but to make it easier to rest within them. There was no horizon to focus on, no distance demanding to be considered, only the water around her, the warmth in her bones, and the soft golden patches of light. She closed her eyes for a while, listening to the gentle sounds, Lena's small movements nearby causing ripples to brush against her side, Elias's quiet breathing, the occasional drip of water from a nearby rock, the almost inaudible hiss where a stray draft of cool air met the hot surface of the pool. With her eyes closed, it was even easier to imagine that the springs themselves were breathing, their exhale rising as steam, their inhale pulling the cold down into the depths to be warmed. When Lena spoke again, her voice seemed to arrive through layers of mist, though she sat only a short distance away. "It's strange," she said softly. "Sometimes I feel like I know every stone and every root up here. The path from the town to the springs, the turns, the bridges, this pool, the way the steam moves when the wind changes. It's all so familiar, I could almost walk it with my eyes closed." She paused, and Liv could hear the small splash of her hand moving idly through the water. "And yet," she continued, "when I think of the city, of Oslo, or any other, I can't picture it clearly. I've seen drawings and photographs. I've heard people describe the streets and the buildings and the sounds, but it all feels distant, like a story from a book that I can't quite imagine myself inside." Liv opened her eyes, though the mist still blurred everything beyond an arm's length. "What do you imagine when you try?" she asked. Lena's answer came after a moment of quiet thought. "I imagine a place that never fully rests," she said. "Lights everywhere, even at night. People moving quickly, like they're always late for something. So many things to look at that I wouldn't know where to rest my eyes. Part of me is curious about that, about what it would be like to be anonymous in such a place, just one person among so many others. And another part of me is afraid that if I went, I might not know how to find my way back to myself. Liv let the words settle. She remembered long, bright city nights when the glow from shop windows and apartments and street lamps had turned the sky a hazy orange. She remembered trains and trams full of strangers, each person carrying their own private world behind eyes that rarely met hers. At first, that anonymity had felt freeing. Later, it had sometimes felt like a kind of weightlessness that offered no place to land. I used to like that feeling, Liv said quietly, being no one in particular, walking down a street where no one knew my name. It let me imagine I could become anything at all at any moment. But after a while, it began to feel as if I didn't really belong anywhere specific, like I was always in between. There was a soft ripple as she shifted a little, the stone beneath her shoulder warm and solid. When I came back here, I thought the town might feel too small, but instead it feels slower in a way I didn't know I needed. Still, part of me worries that if I stay, I'll lose something from the city that I haven't quite finished with. And if I go back, I'll lose something here that I've only just started to remember.
Lena's reply was thoughtful, almost a murmur. Maybe you're not meant to decide that yet, she suggested. Maybe that's why the springs called you up here, so you could sit in the middle of it, not having to choose for a little while. Elias, who had been listening in silence, let out a slow breath that might almost have been a quiet laugh. The future always seems to ask for answers before we're ready, but the mountain doesn't mind questions. It's been standing long enough to know that most things work themselves out over time. Their talk did not turn into a long debate. It drifted naturally in and out of silence, like the steam itself. They spoke a little about what spring might look like in the town, about the way the snow would retreat from the edges of the paths first, then from the fields, then from the slopes. Lena wondered aloud what the fjord would look like when the ice at its edges broke apart into floating pieces. Elias mentioned the tasks that came with each season: mending boats, cutting summer timber, helping Olea with the work around the springs. Liv listened, occasionally adding a thought, more often letting their words flow around her like water, an easy current that did not demand too much of her. Eventually, Olea appeared once more at the upper edge of the pool area. Her presence,
framed by rock and pine, seemed almost like part of the landscape, steady, rooted. She told them there was one more pool higher up, where the water was quieter, the heat a touch deeper, and the view, when the mist lifted, opened more fully to the sky. The steps to the third pool were narrower, turning gently as they rose along the hillside. The lanterns here were fewer, placed with careful intention. The sound of water grew softer again, as if the source were sheltered more completely. The air felt slightly denser, rich with the scent of heated stone and mineral. The steam did not billow so much as drift in a continuous, measured way. The third pool was the smallest of the three. It nestled into a natural curve in the rock, its outer edge bordered by low, rounded stones that had been smoothed by years of rising warmth and falling droplets. The water here was not visibly different, but as they entered it, each of them felt the subtle shift immediately. The temperature was a little higher, but more than that, there was an unmistakable stillness to it, as if this was the place where all the movement of the springs settled into a quiet heart. No words were needed at first. They each found a place along the edge where they could rest with ease. Lena on one side, where a flat stone rose just above the waterline. Elias slightly opposite, leaning against the natural curve of the rock. Liv somewhere between them, close enough to feel the presence of both, but with enough space to let her own thoughts stretch out. Above them, the sky was visible in patches where the branches drew back, a pale, immovable canopy. The steam rising from the pool blurred its edges so that the line between air and cloud and mist became uncertain. The surrounding pines stood a little further away here, giving the impression of a small open bowl held gently within the forest's hands. Liv's body, already softened by the earlier pools, slid even more fully into rest. The water wrapped around her with the quiet certainty of something that had been there for centuries, repeatedly warmed by the earth, cooled by the air, rising and falling in its own timeless cycle. She tilted her head until it rested comfortably against the rock, closed her eyes, and for a while simply listened. The sounds here were very subtle. The faintest trickle as fresh water slipped into the pool from some hidden fissure. The soft lap of tiny ripples against stone whenever someone shifted. The quiet sigh of steam as it brushed the cooler air above. Somewhere in the distance, almost too faint to notice, the wind moved through the higher branches of the trees, making a sound like a deep, slow inhale. It was in this near silence that Elias spoke, his voice so gentle that if she had been any more drowsy, she might have thought it was part of her own thoughts. "When the snow melts," he said, not as a demand, but as an observation that had been waiting for the right moment. "Have you thought about what you'll do?" She did not answer immediately. She let the question rest between them, feeling its weight, but also noticing that it did not feel sharp the way similar questions had in the city. Here, in this pool, with warm water holding her steady, and the mountain around her breathing so slowly, the idea of the future seemed less like a cliff and more like another slope to be walked in its own time. Water brushed softly against her neck as she drew a breath, then released it. "I've thought about it, but the thoughts keep changing shape. Some days it seems obvious that I should go back, that I should pick up where I left off, try again with what I've already started. Other days I wake up and look at the hills and the fjord and this house that feels more and more like home again, and I wonder how I ever managed to leave it behind." She opened her eyes, though she kept them fixed on the steam just above the surface, not on either of the others. "I keep waiting to discover that one of those feelings is the right one, and the other is just fear or nostalgia, but so far they both feel real." Elias was quiet for a moment. When he answered, there was no trace of impatience, only an even, steady calm. "It's all right for them both to be real," he said. "Snow can want to stay on the ground and still know it will melt. Wanting doesn't always decide the outcome." She gave a small breath that might have been a laugh if she'd had more energy. "So which am I?" she asked softly. "The snow that wants to stay, or the snow that's ready to melt?" He shifted just enough that the water carried a small wave toward her, then away. "Right now, I think you're the snow that's still falling, not on the ground yet, not melting, just in the air, taking its time." The image settled over her gently. She imagined herself as one of the countless flakes that had drifted down onto the mountains that very morning, each one following invisible currents of air, each one landing in its own place at its own pace. None of them hurried. None of them chose their landing all at once. "I don't have an answer yet," she admitted to the steam and the water, then to either of them. "About Oslo, about staying, about anything that comes after the thaw." "You don't need one," Elias replied. "Not here, not now. The snow doesn't decide what it will be while it's still in the sky." There was no argument in her, no reflexive insistence that she ought to know by now. Instead, she felt something inside her loosen further, like the last knot in a rope being undone. Her uncertainty did not disappear, but it no longer pressed so hard against her ribs. It was simply there, floating, allowed. The warmth of the water, the soft veil of steam, the presence of the others, all of it combined into a feeling she could only think of as being gently held. Her heart, which had been beating in wary quickness for months, beat now in a slow, even rhythm, supported not just by her own will, but by the quiet rhythm of the mountain itself.
For a long time after that, none of them spoke. The third pool seemed to encourage something deeper than conversation, a kind of shared stillness that said more than words could. Lena, floating somewhere to the side, let her legs drift out and her head rest back, eyes closed, as if she too had found a place where questions did not need to be answered immediately. The day outside the springs continued its slow turning. Light shifted behind the clouds, touching snowfields and distant ridges in muted gradients. But here in the courtyard, time felt stretched, softened by steam and warmth and the ancient patience of the stone. When they would eventually leave the water, wrap themselves once more in robes, and walk back through the forest toward the town, the questions of spring and city and future would return in their own way. But for now, in the quiet heart of the mountain, held by the third pool and the steady breath of the land around them, it was enough for Liv simply to be where she was, no longer pulled so sharply between two worlds, but resting for a while in the gentle space between. By the time they rose from the third pool, the day outside had softened into evening. The light above the courtyard had dimmed to a pale grey, and the steam that rose from the springs seemed to glow more distinctly, as if it were holding on to the last of the day's colour while the sky let it go. Their skin was flushed from the heat, their limbs pleasantly heavy, and when the cooler air brushed against them as they stepped out of the water, it felt less like a shock and more like a gentle reminder that the world beyond the pools still existed. Olea was waiting for them near the walkway, her shawl pulled a little tighter around her shoulders, but her expression content. She had the look of someone who had seen many such evenings and never quite tired of them. In her hands she held a lantern that gave off a mellow light, the flame inside steady and unhurried. "You've done well," she said, her voice low and soothing as they approached. "The springs have had their time with you for today. Now it's the turn of simpler comforts." She gestured with her free hand toward a small wooden hut set slightly apart from the pools, closer to the line where the courtyard melted back into the forest. From its single window spilled a soft golden light, warm and inviting against the encroaching blue of the early night. The faint smell of cooking drifted toward them on the rising steam, savory and rich, edged with the sweetness of roasted vegetables and the clean sharpness of herbs. "Come," Olea added, "the evening meal is ready. You shouldn't walk back to the town with only hot water in your stomachs." They wrapped their robes more closely around themselves and padded along the damp planks of the walkway. Their earlier steps, made on the way to the pools, had been full of quiet anticipation. Now there was a depth of ease in their bodies that made each movement slower but more certain. The steam parted as they went, then closed gently behind them, carrying with it the fading echoes of the springs.
The hut that awaited them had been built in the same simple, thoughtful style as the rest of the courtyard. Dark wood, low roof, sturdy beams. A small porch sheltered the doorway, and under its overhang a stack of split logs rested neatly against the wall, as if ready to be called into service on colder nights than this. The light from inside glowed through the window like honey held in glass, turning the condensation on the panes into a soft, luminous blur. As they stepped through the door, the warmth of the springs was joined by another kind of warmth, the kind that comes from a room where something has been cooking slowly for a long time. The air was thick with the scent of simmering broth, roasted root vegetables, and fresh bread that had only recently left the oven. There was a faint note of smoke as well, not harsh, but reminiscent of wood fired properly and often, the signature of meals prepared in the old way. The interior of the hut was small, but it did not feel cramped. A single wooden table occupied most of the central space, its surface smoothed by many years of use. The grain of the wood rippled gently under the lamplight, and a few small nicks and scratches told quiet stories of gatherings long past. A bench ran along one side, and a pair of sturdy chairs stood opposite, their backs curved just enough to be comfortable. In one corner, a cast-iron stove radiated a steady glow, its mouth closed but alive with embers that pulsed now and then like a slow heartbeat. On the table was an arrangement that made Liv's chest tighten with a soft kind of gratitude. A deep pot, its lid slightly askew, released thin ribbons of fragrant steam. Beside it sat a wide bowl piled high with roasted root vegetables, carrots, parsnips, and chunks of golden beet, their edges caramelized to a gentle crisp, glistening with oil and flecks of herbs. A loaf of bread, crust split along the top in a deliberate rustic pattern, rested on a wooden board, a small knife laid beside it. Nearby, a ceramic teapot exhaled its own quiet stream of steam, the scent of mixed herbs and mint rising from its spout, clean and calming. Lena breathed in deeply and closed her eyes for a moment, as if the smell alone was enough to nourish her. "You've outdone yourself," she murmured to her aunt. Olea made a small dismissive motion with her hand, though there was obvious pleasure in her face. "The mountain does most of the work," she said. "I only keep an eye on the fire. Sit all of you. You've been floating about in water. It's time you felt the weight of a chair under you again." They took their places at the table, robes wrapped snugly, hair still a little damp from the springs. Liv sat on the bench with Lena, while Elias settled into one of the chairs opposite, his posture relaxed, but with the quiet attentiveness of someone for whom helping was as natural as breathing. Olea moved around them with the practiced calm of someone who had done this many evenings before, ladling creamy fish soup from the pot into waiting bowls. The soup was thick, the base pale and velvety, swirled with small flecks of herbs. Pieces of tender fish rested within it, their surfaces just visible when the broth shifted. Thin slices of root vegetables floated among them, their colors muted by the cooking, but their shape still distinct. As Olea set a bowl in front of Liv, the steam carried up the scent of the sea and the hillside together, a mingling of fish, cream, and the sharp green of dill and parsley. "Eat while it's hot," Olea said, her tone gentle but firm, the way one might address both guests and beloved family. "The springs ask much of the body. It's only fair to give something back." The first spoonful of soup warmed Liv all over again, but in a different way from the water. The heat spread from her mouth down through her chest, pooling in her stomach and radiating outward. The fish was tender, flaking easily at the touch of the spoon, and the herbs brightened the richness of the broth without overpowering it. There was a faint hint of something else as well, a root or spice she could not quite name, that grounded the flavor, reminding her of the forest in winter and the deep soil beneath the snow. The roasted vegetables were sweet and savory, edges slightly crisp, insides soft enough to offer no resistance. The bread, when cut, gave a satisfying crackle as the crust broke, revealing an interior that was dense but airy, still warm from the oven. Elias took charge of slicing it, holding the loaf steady with one hand and guiding the knife in slow, even strokes with the other. Each slice fell neatly away and was placed in a small pile on a wooden plate, which he nudged toward the others. "Take some," he said quietly. "It's better eaten before it has time to think about cooling." Lena laughed softly and reached for a slice, tearing off a piece to dip into her soup. Liv did the same, feeling the texture of the bread yield under her fingers, the crust rough and satisfying, the inside smooth and slightly springy. When she dipped it into the soup, it soaked up the broth readily, growing heavier in her hand before she brought it to her mouth. For a time, the only sounds in the hut were those of eating, the gentle clink of spoons against bowls, the quiet rustle of cloth as someone shifted in their seat, the occasional small sigh of appreciation, breathed more than spoken. The lamplight washed over everything with a steady glow, casting slow-moving shadows along the walls whenever someone lifted an arm or leaned forward to reach for more. It was Lena who began the conversation again, as she often did, her curiosity settling naturally on whatever thread seemed most interesting in the moment. She had finished most of her soup and now sat with her hands wrapped around her cup of tea, watching the steam curl upward in pale spirals. "Liv," she said after a pause, "what is winter like in Oslo?" The question was simple, but there was something earnest in it, a longing not only for information, but for a feeling, for an atmosphere she could try to imagine. Her eyes were steady on Liv's face, open and attentive. Liv sat back slightly, letting her spoon rest in the bowl. The question seemed to reach out into a part of her memory she had not visited in a concentrated way for some time. "It It depends where you are, she began slowly, choosing her words with the same gentle care she might use in stepping onto ice. In the mornings, the streets can be very quiet, especially if it snowed in the night. The buildings hold the wind in certain places, and the snow piles up in corners and along the sides of cars. Sometimes it still looks clean and untouched, like here, but very quickly it starts to melt where people walk and drive. It turns gray in patches or slushy. Lena listened closely, her head tilted just a fraction. That sounds less pretty, she admitted with a little smile. Liv smiled back. It can be, she agreed. But there's a kind of beauty to it, too, in its own way. The air in winter is different in the city. It's colder in a sharper way because the wind comes down the streets like it's being funneled. Your face stings a little when you walk. But then you step into a cafe or a shop and it feels like stepping into a pocket of warmth that someone has deliberately carved out of the cold. She glanced down at her bowl, seeing instead the memory of a small cafe window, yellow light spilling onto a dark pavement. There are cafes on so many corners. Some are very modern, with smooth surfaces and glass and steel. Others are older, with worn wooden tables and slightly crooked chairs. People sit by the windows with their scarves still half on, their hands around hot cups. There's always the smell of coffee and baked things, cinnamon buns, pastries, bread. Sometimes you hear the hiss of milk being steamed or the soft clatter of cups and saucers. As she spoke, the hut around them seemed, for a moment, to expand and overlap with those images, this warm, wood-lined space holding within it the distant reflection of another kind of warmth filtered through glass and electric light. And outside the cafes? Lena prompted gently. Outside, she continued, the streets are busy, even in winter. People hurry along, their coats buttoned up, their steps making wet sounds on the pavement. Traffic moves constantly, buses sighing as they stop and start, trams rattling along their rails, cars passing with a hiss if the road is wet, or a crunch if there's ice and snow. There are lights everywhere, street lights, traffic lights, the lights from windows and signs. At night, when the sky is dark early, all of those lights reflect on the ground, especially if it has been raining or snowing. She paused for a sip of tea, the herbal mint blend cooling her mouth in a way that contrasted pleasantly with the memory of hot air inside a crowded room. On clear days, she added, you can see the fjord there too. It's different from here, more crowded with docks and buildings, more boats, different smells, but it's still water. And beyond it, you can still see hills, though they're farther away. Lena seemed to hold all of this carefully in her mind. And the sound? She asked. If you stand on a street and close your eyes, what does it sound like? Liv considered, letting the question settle. It's never truly quiet, she said. You hear footsteps always, the sound of shoes on stone or asphalt. You hear engines, close or distant, and sometimes sirens in the far background, sharp and brief. You hear voices, many at once, so that you can't easily pick out a single conversation unless you are very close. The city has a hum. Even late at night, when most people are home, there are still sounds. You can feel that there are always people awake somewhere, moving somewhere. Lena nodded slowly. It sounds big, she said, searching for the right word. Full. Maybe a little overwhelming. It can be, Liv admitted gently. But it can also feel exciting. There's always somewhere to go, somewhere open, someone awake, something happening. You never feel like you've reached the edges. There is always more beyond, whatever corner you last turned. Elias had been mostly quiet as they spoke, his attention divided between listening and tending the bread. Ole had handed him a small iron pan to place over the stove's open top, and he now held slices of bread over the gentle heat, turning them occasionally so that they toasted evenly. The smell of warming crust joined the rest of the aromas in the room, deepening the sense of comfort. Every now and then, as Liv described a particular detail, the damp sheen of the streets in the evening, the muffled noise of a tram rolling past, the way the air in winter smelled faintly of metal and exhaust combined, Elias's eyes would flicker up from the bread, his eyes reflecting a quiet curiosity. He had no need to live that life himself, but he listened as someone might listen to a description of a far-off shore, foreign but part of the same world. Ole moved infrequently, adding a log to the stove now and then, or refilling a cup of tea. Her presence was like the hut itself, steady, enveloping, dependable. She did not ask many questions, but she watched Liv with the gentle, assessing impression of someone who had seen many people come up the mountain carrying invisible burdens, and who had learned how to judge when those burdens were lightening. When Lena had satisfied some of her curiosity about the streets and sounds, her questions turned softer, more personal. "Did you feel at home there?" she asked, her voice quiet enough that it did not break the calm of the room. Liv took a moment before she answered. "Sometimes," she said, "in certain places, with certain people, at certain times of day. There are corners of Oslo that feel like they belong to you after a while. A particular bench in a park, a little stretch of shoreline, a cafe where the staff start to recognize you. But the city as a whole," she trailed off, searching for the right description.
It felt, she continued at last, like a place that could hold you if you kept moving. It didn't ask you to stay still very often. Here, the mountains don't mind if you sit in one place and do nothing but breathe for a while. There, it sometimes felt as though if you stopped for too long, the world might flow around you and make you feel left behind.
Lena glanced toward the window, where the dark outside pressed softly against the glass, the golden light from inside turning the reflection of the forest into a faint suggestion only. "Here," she said, "the world is small, but it feels full. I sometimes wonder what it would be like to stand in a place where I couldn't see the edges. But then I think of the springs and the harbor and my aunt, and I feel anchored, I suppose." "There is a kind of freedom in being anchored," Olea observed, refilling her own cup, "and another kind in being adrift. Most of us need a little of both before we are done." Their meal stretched on gently, not because there was an excessive amount of food, but because nothing hurried them. They ate the last of the soup, the spoon scraping softly against the bowls in a way that was more lulling than abrupt. The roasted vegetables dwindled on the platter, the last few pieces taken and savored rather than consumed as an afterthought. The bread, now slightly toasted at the edges, developed a deeper flavor and was spread with a little butter that softened almost instantly on contact with the warm surface. The teapot emptied and was refilled, the new infusion sending up another cloud of steam with a slightly different balance of herbs, this time with a little more mint, which cleared the head while keeping the body at ease. Outside, the evening deepened slowly into full night, and the world beyond the hut's window turned from a soft blue-gray to a velvety darkness, broken only by the occasional flicker of a lantern near the pools, or the pale suggestion of snow where the steam thinned. Eventually, there came a natural lull in the conversation and in their eating, the kind of satisfied quiet that follows a good meal and a day that has asked something of the body but not too much of the spirit. Olea stood and moved to the window, peering briefly out into the night. When she turned back, the lamplight caught the lines of her face in a way that made her look both very old and very young, aged by time, but still lit from within by something enduring and gentle. "The night is clear," she said. "The wind is calm. If you set out soon, you'll have an easy walk down, and the town will still have lights in some windows when you arrive." She looked at Lena in particular, as if to say that it was important she see the town from the mountain at night at least once this winter, with the snow reflecting what little light there was and the path lit by their own hands. They rose slowly from their seats, the benches creaking softly in response. There was a reluctance to leave the hut's golden cocoon, but it was not heavy. It felt more like the natural pause before the final movement of a song. They put on their warmer outer layers again in the small changing hut. Coats, scarves, hats, gloves, each piece a barrier between the heat they carried from the springs and the cool embrace of the forest night waiting beyond. Their bodies retained a core of warmth that would take some time to fade. The air that met them as they stepped back outside felt cold against their faces, but in a clean, invigorating way. At the edge of the courtyard, Elias lit the lanterns they would carry down the mountain. Each one flared briefly as the match touched the wick, then settled into a steady flame. The glass sides glowed, the light within them small but determined. When he handed one to Liv and one to Lena, the weight of the handles felt reassuring in their hands. Olea watched them for a moment, then stepped forward to adjust the scarf at Lena's neck and to rest a hand lightly on Liv's arm. "The path you took up brought you here. The path you take down may look different, but it is the same in its bones. Walk slowly. Let the night show you what the day could not." With that, she stepped back, and the three of them turned toward the opening in the trees where the forest path began its descent. Night had fully claimed the mountain now, but the snow kept the darkness from becoming complete. It lay along the path and on the slopes, catching what little light there was and sending it back in a muted silvery shimmer. The beams from their lanterns cut through the air in soft cones, illuminating the ground immediately before them, while leaving the edges of their vision in a gentle blur. Their footsteps, which had sounded soft and cushioned on the way up, took on a slightly different tone now. The snow, cooling again after the day's small warmth and the brief rise in temperature from the springs, held their boots with a firmer but still yielding touch. Each step produced a faint, compressed sound, a quiet confirmation of weight and movement that echoed lightly between the tree trunks. The wooden railings along certain parts of the path cast long shadows on the snow, alternating bands of faint brightness and deeper gray that shifted as their lanterns swayed with each stride. The pattern of light and shadow was like a slow-moving weave, the forest briefly patterned by their passage and then softening back into a more uniform darkness once they had gone by. The air was colder now than it had been when they first climbed. The day's warmth fully surrendered to the night. Their breaths emerged in soft rhythmic puffs, small clouds that formed and dissolved in front of them with each inhale and exhale. The sound of their breathing became part of the night's texture, a gentle accompaniment to the muffled whisper of wind in the higher branches, and the occasional quiet crack from deeper in the forest as ice adjusted its grip on rock and wood. For much of the descent they walked without the need for many words. The lanterns swung between them, the light reflecting faintly from the frost on the bark of the trees and from the glassy surfaces of small patches of ice where snow had melted and refrozen during the day. In the distance, through the gaps between the trunks, they could see the faint scattered lights of the town beginning to appear, like small stars that had fallen and chosen to rest on the slopes and beside the water. After a while, the path narrowed slightly, and instinctively Liv and Lena drew closer together, walking side by side. Their shoulders brushed now and then, the contact and unconscious reassurance of shared company in the dimness. Their lanterns cast overlapping circles of light on the ground, making the snow ahead seem a little brighter. They began to speak again, not of heavy things now, but of small, gentle topics that suited the quiet of the descent. Lena pointed out familiar landmarks along the way that looked different at night, the outline of a boulder that resembled an animal in certain light, the shape of a particular tree whose leaning trunk made it stand out from the others, the place where the path curved slightly more than it needed to for the sake of an old root system beneath. "Sometimes," she said softly, "when I come down from the springs alone, I pretend that each lantern is a little echo of the ones in town, that the mountain is practicing in its own way how to hold light." I smiled at the thought. "And does it do a good job?" she asked. "I think so," Lena replied. "The town has more lights, but they have to work harder. Here, the darkness doesn't mind sharing."
They spoke a little about the meals they loved most in winter, about small habits that made the long nights feel shorter, certain books, certain songs, certain simple rituals like lighting a candle before sleep, or stepping outside just once to look at the sky, no matter how cold it was. They shared the kind of details that don't change the course of a life, but do help fill it with texture and comfort. Ahead of them, Elias walked at a steady, unhurried pace, his lantern held slightly higher to illuminate as much of the path as possible. Every so often he would glance back over his shoulder, his eyes catching the lantern light for a moment to make sure that they were close and moving comfortably. When the path steepened or the snow grew uneven, he would slow without being asked, letting them match his speed. His presence was like a solid line drawn through the night, something to follow without question. As they descended further, the distant lights of the town grew clearer, their reflections stretching gently across the surface of the fjord where the water was not frozen. The sky above the mountains remained pale and empty of stars behind the thin veil of clouds, but the snow underfoot glowed with its own quiet radiance, each flake compressed into a soft, luminous field by the day's footsteps. Near the place where the forest began to thin and the first outlines of fences and small sheds appeared, they paused for a moment on a slightly wider part of the path. From here the town could be seen more fully, a scatter of golden squares where windows were lit, strings of lamps along the harbor, the faint suggestion of movement where someone crossed a yard or a road. "It looks small from up here," Liv said, her voice barely above a breath. "It is small," Lena replied, "but that doesn't mean it isn't enough." Liv watched the way the light from the town held itself against the darkness, neither overpowering it nor surrendering to it. The springs, the mountain, the forest, the little hut with its fish soup and roasted roots, they were all behind her now, but their warmth lingered in her body and in her thoughts. The city still existed farther away, with its endless possibilities and relentless motion. But at this moment, on this path, with the snow under her boots and the lantern in her hand, and Lena's shoulder occasionally touching her own, the pull between those two worlds felt gentler, less like a tearing and more like a slow, patient weaving.
Elias gave a small nod toward the town. "Come," he said softly. "The lights won't wait up forever." They took their last steps out of the forest together, the lantern swinging one final time between the trees before the open space of the slope welcomed them back. The snow near the first houses had been disturbed by more feet, and the sounds of the town, muted and sparse at this hour, but present, began to drift toward them in soft hints. A door closing, a dog barking once, the faint clink of dishes being washed somewhere behind a window. As they followed the familiar road downward, the springs already hidden behind the dark line of the trees, Liv carried with her the memory of the steam, the warmth, the dinner in the lamp-lit hut, and the slow descent through the forest. They felt less like isolated scenes and more like pieces of a single continuous breath, a long quiet exhale that the mountain had kindly shared with her on this winter day. The choice of what would come after the snow melted still waited somewhere beyond the horizon of her thoughts. But for now, walking between the soft glow of the town and the deep steady shadow of the hills, the only decision she needed to make was how slowly to take her next step. And in that simple, measured act, there was a kind of peace she had not known she had been missing. By the time Liv and the others reached the lower edge of the town, the night had fully settled in. The lanterns they carried had done their work along the forest path, marking each careful step with a small circle of light. But now they were no longer the only glow in the world. Ahead of them, scattered along the slope and gathered more thickly near the harbor, the windows of the houses shone with a warm, steady brightness. Each one seemed to hold its own little fire, its own small universe of voices, cups, and quiet movements. As they parted from Elias and Lena near the point where their ways naturally diverged, Lena toward a cluster of houses closer to the water, Elias to a path that would lead him home by a slightly higher road, Liv felt no tug of sadness, only a gentle awareness that the day was folding itself into its final shape. There would be other walks, other evenings. Today had simply been one carefully turned page among many. She climbed the last short rise to Solveig's cottage with a slowness that came not from fatigue, but from the desire to linger in the in-between for just a little longer. The snow here was familiar underfoot, the path worn by years of use, but tonight it seemed touched by something new. The light in the cottage window reached out into the dark, golden and soft, pooling on the snow in a subtle reflection. It looked very much like a home that had been waiting, without impatience, for someone to return. From outside she could already sense the difference between the air of the town and the air of the cottage. Here, just beyond the door, it was possible to smell the faint trace of smoke woven with something sharper and sweeter, like ginger and dried leaves warmed in water. The chimney sent up a slender thread of smoke that disappeared into the night, but most of the warmth and scent remained held patiently inside. When she opened the door and stepped into the small entryway, the contrast between outdoors and indoors wrapped her all at once. Heat rose gently from the floorboards, carrying with it the smell of burning wood and something bright like ginger root sliced thin. The glow of the fire reached her before she saw it, spreading in a low arc across the room and catching on the edges of the table, the shelves, the old rocking chair near the hearth. Solveig was in the kitchen, moving slowly but surely between the stove and the table. On the stove, a small pot simmered, the contents pale gold and fragrant. Nearby, 2 mugs sat ready, each with a spoon resting inside and a small dish of honey placed between them. A bundle of dried pine needles, bound together with twine, lay on the table as well, their scent carrying the memory of the forest into the room in a softer, more delicate form. She looked up as Liv entered, and the smile that moved over her face was not surprised, but quietly pleased, as if she had trusted the day to bring her granddaughter back in its own time. "There you are," she said, her voice low and even. "I thought I heard the snow on the path complaining less. It does that when someone familiar walks on it." Liv slipped off her coat and boots, her movements a little slower now. The weight of the day and the lingering warmth of the springs made her limbs feel pleasantly heavy. As she stepped into the main room, the sight of the fire in the grate met her fully. Orange and amber flames moving steadily around the dark shapes of the logs, sending out waves of heat that glowed against the stone and the old iron tools nearby. On a small, low stool beside the hearth, a towel had been draped neatly, as if someone had thought ahead to the moment when she would want to sit there and let the last traces of mountain water leave her hair. A small sachet of dried pine and herbs hung nearby from a hook, releasing a faint soothing scent whenever the air shifted.
"I made ginger tea," Solveig said, turning back to the pot and giving it one final slow stir. "With a little lemon peel and some mint. There's honey if you want it." It felt like the kind of day that should end in something warm and sharp to remind the body that it is still very much alive. Liv moved closer to the fire and lowered herself onto the stool. The warmth from the flames reached her face, drying the last faint chill around her cheeks. She took the towel and began to run it gently through her hair, squeezing out the moisture where it still clung near the ends. The movements were slow, almost meditative. Each pass of the cloth felt like another way of returning to herself after the pools, the steam, the forest. Solveig poured the tea into the mugs. The liquid a soft, translucent amber. A faint curl of steam rose from each one, carrying the intertwined scents of ginger, mint, and citrus. She added a spoonful of honey to one cup, then paused and glanced toward Liv. "Honey?" she asked. "Please," Liv answered, her voice drifting in from the space between attention and gentle drowsiness. Solveig nodded and let a drizzle of honey fall into the second cup, the thick thread of gold catching the light before sinking beneath the surface and disappearing. She brought one mug to Liv, setting it carefully on a small stand near the hearth, where the heat from the fire would keep it warm without cooling too quickly, and kept the other for herself, wrapping her hands around it as she settled into the chair nearby. For a while they sat quietly. Liv continued to dry her hair, feeling the dampness diminish, and the warmth from both fire and tea reach deeper into her. Solveig took slow sips, closing her eyes now and then as the ginger spread its comforting heat down her throat and into her chest. The crackle of the fire, the occasional shift of a log, the soft rattle of the window when a faint gust touched the pane, these sounds formed a gentle backdrop that needed no interruption. Eventually, when most of the water had been coaxed from her hair and the towel lay folded on her lap, Liv reached for her mug. The ceramic was warm against her fingers, and the tea itself, when she lifted it to her lips, was just hot enough to require a careful first sip. The ginger's warmth was immediate, bright, but not harsh, softened by the honey and the coolness of mint. It felt like a continuation of the hot springs, but in a form that belonged squarely to the cottage. Solveig watched her for a moment, seeing the way her shoulders had lowered, the way her gaze had softened. When she spoke, her words were quiet, and they slipped into the room like another layer of warmth, rather than anything that disturbed the calm. "And," she asked gently, "did the mountain say anything interesting today?" Liv let a small, tired smile touch her face. "It said many things, most of them without words." "That is its usual way," Solveig agreed. "But did you hear anything here?" She tapped lightly against her own chest, just over her heart. "Any new ideas knocking about?" The question might, on another day, have made Liv feel cornered, pressed toward an answer she did not yet have. But now, wrapped in the aftermath of the springs, with the smell of dried pine and ginger all around her, and the fire's glow reaching out in waves, it felt like an invitation rather than a demand. She thought of the pools, the first gentle and opening, the second wrapped in mist and golden light, the third small and still, holding their silence with such patience. She thought of Lena's curiosity, of Elias's quiet reassurance, of Ola's steady presence framed by steam. She thought of the path up and the path down, of the town below them and the city beyond the horizon. She took another sip of tea, letting the warmth rest within her for a moment before she answered. "No new answers," she said at last, tilting her head slightly in acknowledgement. "But I do have a feeling." Solveig nodded slowly, encouraging her without rushing. "And what kind of feeling is that?" She looked into the fire as she spoke, watching the way the flames leaned and folded around the wood, It's like... She paused, searching for the right shape for what had been moving through her since they left the third pool. Like standing on a path and realizing you don't have to pick up your pace, that you can keep walking just as you are, without knowing exactly where it ends. She glanced toward her grandmother, her smile deepening a fraction. I still don't know if I'll go back to Oslo in the spring. I still don't know what I would do here instead if I stayed. But for the first time, that not knowing doesn't feel like a weight. It feels not urgent, like I don't have to decide before the snow melts. Solveig murmured, a sound of quiet approval. That sounds like a good kind of feeling. Liv gave a soft, breathy laugh. So, if you're asking if I've come back with a plan, the answer is no. But if you're asking whether something has changed, I think it has. Just a little. Solveig's gaze softened even further. That's more than enough for one day. Sometimes the smallest shift is the one that lets all the others happen later. It's good to have a sense of not being in a hurry. The mountain isn't. The snow isn't. We don't need to be either. They fell into silence again after that, but it was a different kind of silence than before. This one carried with it the shared understanding of something acknowledged, something gently placed on the table between them and then allowed to rest. The fire continued its slow work, reducing logs into glowing embers and then to ash. The tea cooled gradually in their cups, but not so much that each sip did not still bring comfort. When the mugs were finally empty, and the pine sachet hanging by the hearth had released the last of its fragrance for the night, Liv rose and made her way to the stairs. Her body was tired in the best possible way, not strained or heavy with worry, but softened, ready for sleep. Each step up to her small room felt like the closing of another page in the story of the day. Upstairs, the bedroom was cool, but the sheets of her little bed felt welcoming, the fabric holding the faint scent of soap and old linen. The small window above the bed framed a portion of the night sky and the slope of the hill beyond. Snow was still falling, but very slowly now, in light, soft flakes that drifted down like feathers released from some distant pillow. They moved in patterns dictated by air currents too gentle to feel, sometimes pausing mid-air before continuing their descent. She changed into her nightclothes, the fabric soft against skin that still remembered the embrace of warm water. As she slipped under the covers, the mattress hugging the curve of her body, she felt that same sense of being held that she had known in the third pool, only now it was the house, and the bed, and the familiar creak of the rafters above that did the holding. Lying on her back, she let her thoughts wander slowly over the day. The forest came first, the sound of snow underfoot, the leaning trunks, the glimpse of the fjord from the first hill, then the bridge and the frozen falls,
the pale blue ice and the distant murmur of water that refused to be completely stilled. The courtyard unfolded in her mind with its drifting steam and brass lanterns, the damp wood under her soles, the sense of stepping into a space the world had hidden away for those who needed it most. She remembered the first touch of the springs around her ankles, the way the warmth had risen in stages, climbing up her body and into the spaces between muscles and bone. She saw Lena resting against the edge of the pool, eyes half closed, speaking of a life spent entirely within the boundaries of these mountains. She heard her own voice answering, admitting the strange balance between the pull of the city and the pull of the town. The second pool returned to her with its thicker mist, its blurred edges, its hovering circles of light. The sound of Lena's questions about Oslo, the images of cafes and crowded streets and damp stone, the strange comfort of trying to explain one world while immersed so fully in another. The third pool glowed in her memory like a small warm stone, its edges precise and its center deep. In that remembered water she heard again the careful calm of Elias's voice, telling her that she did not need an answer yet, that she was like snow still falling. There was a subtle shift in her chest as she lingered on that thought. She realized that at some point during the walk down, or the meal, or the quiet moment by the fire, a new feeling had begun to grow inside her, small but clear, like a candle just lit in a room that had been dim for a long time. It was not a decision. It was not even a resolved intention, but it was something. If she gave it words, they would be simple ones. Maybe I don't need to go back yet. Maybe it's all right if I stay a little longer. The idea did not flare up with urgency. It settled instead, like another layer of snow on the hillside outside, light, soft, but real. It changed the shape of the landscape only slightly, but it did change it. She smiled to herself in the half-darkness of the room, feeling that gentle possibility settle somewhere near her heart, not as a promise, but as a direction that might be followed when the time felt right. The air in the room held faint traces of the day, a whisper of steam that still seemed to cling to her skin, the ghost of forest scent caught in her hair, the memory of roasted root vegetables and fish soup, of ginger and honey, of pine and wool and wood smoke. They layered over one another in her senses until she was not sure which belonged to the springs and which belonged to the house. It did not matter. They all belonged to the same quiet world now. Her thoughts drifted to Lena's bright, curious eyes, full of questions about places she had never seen but could imagine so vividly. then to Elias, whose steady presence on the path and at the pools had made it easier to let the day unfold without trying to control every moment. She thought of Olia, standing in her courtyard of steam and lanterns, listening for the mountain's mood. She thought of Solwig, waiting with ginger tea and pine sachets, asking not for plans, but for feelings. The future, when she tried to look toward it, remained hazy, like the slopes beyond the springs seen through drifting mist. There were no clear shapes yet, no firm outlines of what she would do when the ice on the fjord broke, when the first shoots pushed up through the thawing earth. But the haziness no longer alarmed her. Instead of feeling like a fog she could lose herself in, it felt like dawn, soft and undefined, but gently promising. Outside, the snow continued to fall at its unhurried pace, each flake finding its way to a resting place on roof, tree, or field. Somewhere below, in the lower part of the house, the last embers in the hearth would be dimming, their warmth sinking into the bricks and stones. In the town, a few lights would still be burning in windows where someone lingered over a book or a quiet conversation. And high above them all, the mountains watched with the same calm patience they had held for generations in winter and summer alike. As Liv's breathing grew slower and her body sunk more fully into the bed, the events of the day loosened their grip on her waking mind and slipped into the soft space that lies just before sleep. The hot springs, the forest, the dinner, the lanterns on the path, the fire, the ginger tea, they all became part of the same long, gentle exhale. For now, nothing needed to be solved. Nothing needed to be decided. It was enough to have walked where she had walked, to have listened to what she had heard, to have felt what she had felt. The night gathered the little town into itself, tucking it in beneath a quilt of new snow and quiet air. The fjord lay still, carrying the faint reflection of a sky hidden behind clouds. The trees stood with their branches heavy and serene, and in the small attic room, beneath the sloping roof and the softly frosted window, Liv let go of wakefulness and moved slowly, peacefully into sleep. And as you lie here now, listening to the last notes of this winter day fade into the distance, you can allow yourself to do the same. There is nowhere you need to be except where you are. No answers you need to force, no decisions you must reach before morning. Let the warmth you've imagined linger in your limbs. Let the quiet of the forest and the glow of the springs rest gently in your thoughts, and let the snow outside fall at its own calm, patient pace. Rest your eyes, let your breathing deepen, and let the night hold you just as the mountain held Liv. Sleep well and good night.